The hydrangeas needed deadheading. I'd been putting it off for 2 weeks, telling myself the heat was too much for a woman my age to be kneeling in the garden. But the truth was, I'd simply been waiting for a reason to go outside and feel useful. I pulled on my garden gloves, the worn leather ones with the split seam on the left thumb that I keep meaning to replace, and stepped off the back porch into the late morning light. Asheville in September has a particular kind of quiet to it. The tourists have mostly thinned out. The mountain air carries just enough chill to make physical work feel dignified rather than punishing, and the light comes in sideways through the oaks in a way that makes everything look a little softer than it actually is. I was on my knees beside the garden bed, pinching off the spent blooms and letting them fall into the bucket beside me, when I heard my phone chime from the porch railing where I'd set it down. I didn't rush. I've reached an age where I've stopped rushing toward things that can wait. When I finally picked it up, I saw it was a notification from Instagram. My niece Becca had tagged a post. I almost scrolled past it. Becca posts constantly, mostly photos of her sourdough loaves and her labradoodle, but the caption stopped me cold. So honored to be on the planning committee for C&S's big celebration. Savannah in October is going to be something special. The Langford family really knows how to do things right. There was a photo below the caption. Becca, grinning, holding up a cream-colored envelope with an embossed wax seal. Beside her stood 2 women I recognized as Serena's cousins. They were all wearing the same expression, that particular brightness that only comes when someone believes they are standing inside a circle they were chosen for. I sat down on the porch steps. Connor and Serena's 5th anniversary vow renewal. I'd heard Serena mention it in passing the last time I'd called, back in July. She'd kept the details vague, the way she always did when she was telling me just enough to seem inclusive. I hadn't thought much of it then. I had told myself the invitations would come. I told myself a lot of things in those years that turned out to be ways of managing what I already sensed but wasn't ready to name. I set the phone face down on the step beside me and looked out at the garden for a long time. The bucket of dead blooms sat in the dirt. The oak leaves moved overhead in a small wind. I thought about my son's voice the last time we'd spoken, how it had taken on that careful, managed quality, the way it does when someone is being kind as a form of keeping you at a distance. I picked the phone back up and checked the date on Becca's post. It had been up for 11 days. I went inside and washed my hands at the kitchen sink, watching the dirt swirl down the drain in the slow, methodical way of things that are simply done. Then I sat at the kitchen table and thought about the last 32 years with the kind of honesty I usually reserve for very early mornings or the car ride home from the doctor. My husband Ray died when Connor was 9. A construction accident, the kind that makes the local news for one day and then disappears. We had a small life insurance policy, a mortgage with 7 years left on it, and a son who stopped speaking for 3 weeks after the funeral. I kept the house. I took a second job at the hospital on weekends, working admissions, which was easier on my feet than the floor shifts, but harder on something else I don't have a clean word for. I learned to read grief in strangers' faces by the way they held their paperwork. Connor was a serious boy who became a serious young man, valedictorian, then pre-law at UNC, then a 3-year stretch at Duke Law that I helped fund through a combination of what Ray's insurance had left, my retirement contributions, and a home equity line I told myself was an investment in the future. He graduated with honors and took a position at a firm in Charlotte. I drove down for the ceremony and sat in the 3rd row and cried so hard the woman beside me offered me a tissue from her purse. He met Serena 2 years later. Serena Langford, whose family had been in Savannah real estate for 3 generations and who carried herself with the particular ease of someone who has never had to choose between 2 things they both need. She was polished and intelligent, and I could tell from their first dinner together that she was genuinely fond of Connor, which mattered to me. What I didn't account for was that she came with an entire ecosystem: parents, cousins, family, friends, a social calendar that operated like a second job, and that Connor would find his footing in that ecosystem in a way that quietly, gradually replaced his footing in mine. The calls became shorter. The visits became holidays only. Then every other holiday. I stopped expecting to be called for the small things, job news, dinner decisions, weekends away, and started calibrating my expectations downward until they fit inside something manageable. I told myself this was normal. I told myself all grown children do this. What I did not tell myself, because I wasn't ready to, was that I was still being used for the large things. The first loan cosign came 4 years into his marriage. Connor wanted to open a private mediation practice, pulling away from the firm to go independent. He needed a business line of credit. His own credit was strong, but the lender wanted a cosigner with property assets for the initial draw. I signed. I told myself it was a formality. He told me the same. 18 months later, there was a commercial lease for a larger office space. Again, my name beside his on the dotted line. Again, just a formality. Just while we get established. You're the only one I trust with something like this, Mom. I never asked what happened with Serena's family. Whether they were asked and declined, or whether I was simply the path of least resistance. I didn't ask, because I was afraid of the answer. By the time I saw Becca's post that September morning, my name was on 2 documents of financial consequence that Connor had never once mentioned in any conversation we'd had since the ink dried. I had co-signed for a man who had apparently put together a guest list for a significant family celebration and not found room on it for his mother. I let that land for the rest of the day. I didn't call. I went back out to the garden after lunch and finished deadheading the hydrangeas. I made soup for dinner. I fed the cat. I went to bed and lay in the dark and did what I have found, at 67. To be the most useful thing a person can do when they've been hurt. I let myself feel it completely rather than folding it up and storing it somewhere. The next morning, I called my neighbor Helen and asked if she wanted to walk the trail behind the park. Helen is 71 and has known me since the year Ray died, which means she has seen every version of me that I am not always willing to show other people. We walked for an hour, and I told her what I'd seen. She didn't offer explanations or silver linings. She just walked beside me and said, when I had finished, "What are you going to do?" I said I didn't know yet. 2 days later, I found out what I was dealing with. I had been watching Becca's posts with a detached, methodical attention that I recognized as the same energy I used to bring to difficult patient files at the hospital. The kind of focus that isn't emotional, so much as it is determined to understand something fully before acting. On Wednesday evening, Becca posted a video from what appeared to be a planning dinner. Serena was there, her mother, 2 cousins. The table was covered in sample menus and fabric swatches. In the background, just briefly visible, was a whiteboard with a rough seating chart drawn on it. I paused the video and enlarged the image as much as my phone would allow. I could make out 3 tables on the right side of the chart. One was labeled Langford Immediate. One was labeled Firm Partners plus Clients. The third had a heading I couldn't fully read, but the table below my son's name, his name, in Connor's own handwriting that I would know anywhere, had no seats marked on the left side at all. The left side, I had learned from 32 years of watching how my son thinks, was always where he placed the people he was obligated to, rather than the people he chose. I was not even a seat on an obligation table. I had not made the chart. I closed the video and set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood very still for what felt like a long time. Then I opened the drawer beside the refrigerator where I keep documents I might need quickly. Behind the takeout menus and the pharmacy receipts, there was a manila folder. Inside the folder was a deed, a financial summary from my retirement account, and a copy of a will I had last updated 11 years ago. I read through the relevant sections in the voice I use for understanding things I have been avoiding. My estate, the house, the savings, a small investment account. Ray had started before he died that I had left mostly untouched. The named beneficiary, Connor Thomas Callahan, my son. I put the folder back in the drawer and called my attorney. Franklin Webb had handled my affairs for 20 years, since the refinance that saved the house when Connor was in high school. His office was downtown, above the old hardware store on Lexington, and it smelled of cedar and old paper and the quiet authority of someone who has seen enough human behavior to be unsurprised by most of it. I sat across from him on Thursday morning and told him everything. He listened with his hands folded, the way he always does. And when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How sure are you?" he said. "Sure enough that I drove down here rather than calling," I said. He nodded and opened his laptop. "Let's look at what we have." What we had was a will that gave Connor everything. A house with equity I had spent 3 decades building, and 2 co-signed financial documents that Franklin pulled up and reviewed with an expression that told me, before he said a word, that I had been more exposed than I understood. "The business line of credit from 4 years ago," he said. "Connor has been making the payments. That's clean. But this office lease renewal from last year," he turned the screen toward me. "He extended it to a 5-year term 8 months ago. Your name is still on the guarantee. He didn't notify you of the extension." I looked at the document. My signature, from the original signing, legally carried forward by a renewal clause that I had not known existed. "Is that legal?" I asked. "It's in the original contract language." "Technically, yes. Ethically," he stopped. "You weren't the client he was building for, Dot. You were the safety net." I sat with that for a moment. Outside, someone was unloading boxes from a truck on the street below. The sound of it, ordinary and indifferent, felt appropriate. "I want to change the will," I said, "and I want my name removed from both documents as quickly as can be managed." Franklin looked at me steadily. "The removal will require Connor's cooperation on the lease. He may not give it willingly once he understands what you're doing. Then we'll work around it," I said. "Start with the will. Do you have someone else in mind?" I had been thinking about this since the night I lay in the dark and let myself feel everything completely. I had thought about it while I walked with Helen. I had thought about it during the long drive down Lexington Avenue that morning, watching the city move around me with its ordinary indifference to individual grief. "Marcus," I said. "Marcus Tilley." Franklin wrote the name down. Marcus was 24. His mother, Carolyn, had been my closest friend for 19 years. The kind of friendship that forms between women in their 40s who have both lost something they didn't expect to lose and find each other, almost by accident, at a church potluck or a school fundraiser, and recognize something familiar. Carolyn died of a pulmonary embolism 3 years ago, without warning, on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Marcus had been 21. He had 2 younger sisters in high school. He had been working full-time at the building supply warehouse since he was 19, quietly and without complaint, the kind of young person who does not announce his sacrifice because he has not been taught to see it as remarkable. He called me every few weeks, not to ask for anything, to check in, the way his mother had taught him. He had driven up from Hendersonville last winter when the ice storm knocked out my power for 2 days, showed up with a generator and a bag of groceries, and stayed long enough to make sure the pipes were clear. When I told him he didn't have to do that, he said, "Miss Dot, Mama would have done it, so I'm doing it." He had been accepted to the electrical engineering program at App State, but deferred twice because the money wasn't there and someone needed to be home for the girls. He'd applied again for the coming spring. I gave Franklin his full name and address and told him about the deferred enrollment. I told him I wanted the documents to include a provision that released funds specifically for education the moment he was ready, with the remainder held in trust until 30. Franklin wrote everything down without comment, which is one of the things I have always appreciated about him. When we were done, he looked up from the documents. "Once this files, he'll be notified." "Good," I said. I drove home through the afternoon, past the park, past the trail where Helen and I had walked. The mountains sat where they always sat, unhurried and indifferent to schedules. I went inside, made a cup of tea, and sat on the back porch. I did not call Connor. I let the afternoon go its own way. The notification arrived the following Monday. I know this because by Monday afternoon my phone had begun to go off in the sustained, almost rhythmic way of something that has no intention of stopping. I was in the middle of folding laundry when the first call came in. Connor's name on the screen, and I set a pillowcase down on the bed and looked at it ring through to voicemail. Then it rang again, then a number I didn't recognize, which I assumed was the Charlotte firm. Then Serena's cell. I finished folding the laundry. I carried it to the closet. I came back, and the phone had rung 4 more times. I went outside and pulled weeds from the vegetable bed along the fence line, which had been needing attention since August. The tomatoes had gone leggy, and the basil had bolted, but the pepper plants were still producing, and I worked my way along the row with a methodical focus that felt, in the circumstances, like a form of dignity. Helen came over around 3, the way she sometimes does on slow afternoons, and raised her eyebrows at the phone screen where it sat face up on the porch railing. "You going to answer that?" she said. "Not today," I said. She sat down and poured herself from the pitcher of iced tea I'd left out. "Good," she said. By 5 o'clock, I had 23 missed calls. I played the voicemails standing at the kitchen sink. Connor's first. "Mom, I need you to call me back right now. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to stop and think about this." Connor's second, an hour later, his voice lower and more controlled, which I recognized as the voice he uses in professional situations, where he is furious but aware he is being recorded. "I understand you've made some changes with Franklin. I would appreciate the courtesy of a conversation before this goes any further. Please call me." A voice I didn't recognize, male, crisp. "Mrs. Callahan, this is David Park with Hensley and Park. We represent Connor Callahan in several business matters. It's come to our attention that recent changes to your estate documentation may affect contractual obligations that your son has in good standing. We'd appreciate a call at your earliest convenience to discuss. Serena." "Dorothy, I don't know what's happened, but I need you to understand that there are serious things at stake here. Connor has been under so much pressure, and I don't think you're seeing the full picture. Please call me. Please." I listened to each one once and deleted them. Then I turned the phone face down and made myself dinner and watched the news and went to bed at 9 o'clock and slept better than I had in weeks. Tuesday, the calls continued. 41 by noon. I spent the morning at the community center where I volunteer twice a week, helping coordinate the senior wellness program. The work is small and consistent scheduling, phone calls, the occasional problem to untangle, and I find it restorative in the way that useful, undervalued work tends to be. I mentioned nothing of what was happening at home. I drove back at lunchtime and found a FedEx envelope wedged between the screen door and the frame. I put it on the kitchen table and made a sandwich and ate it looking at the envelope. Then I pushed it to the side, rinsed my plate, and called Marcus. He answered on the second ring, which he always does. I could hear the warehouse sounds behind him, the deep hum of machinery, and the hollow echo of a large indoor space. "Miss Dot," he said, and the warmth in it was so uncomplicated that I had to hold the phone away from my face for a moment. I told him briefly what I had done. Not the full story, just enough. I told him his name was in the paperwork. There was a long silence. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know I didn't," I said. Another pause. "Miss Dot, you've been showing up for 3 years without being asked," I said. "Your mama taught you well. Now, let me do this." He was quiet again, but differently. "I'm putting in the App State application this week," he said. "Spring enrollment." "Good," I said. "Let me know if anything's missing." I hung up and looked at the FedEx envelope on the table. I left it there for the rest of the afternoon. Connor arrived on Wednesday morning. I heard the car in the driveway before I saw it, the rental, a silver sedan, the kind of car you get at Charlotte Douglas when you haven't planned the trip in advance. I was in the kitchen with my second cup of coffee, and I watched through the window as he came up the front walk, in the same navy suit he wears when he is trying to convey authority, slightly wilted from travel, jaw set in the way that tells me he has rehearsed what he's going to say but isn't fully confident in it. I opened the door before he knocked. He looked at me for a moment and then said, "We need to talk." "Come in," I said. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had done his homework for 12 years, where I had packed his lunches in the mornings before school, where we had eaten Thanksgiving alone the year after Ray died because I couldn't manage to invite anyone over. The FedEx envelope from Hensley and Park was still on the table between us, unopened. He glanced at it but didn't ask. "I need you to understand what you're doing," he said. "This isn't Mom. You're not just changing a document. You're destabilizing something I've spent years building." "I understand what I'm doing," I said. "Do you?" "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like a reaction. An emotional reaction to something that was—" He stopped. "To something that was what?" I said. He ran a hand along the table edge. "The vow renewal. The invitation. I know that's what started this." "When were you going to send one?" I said. He looked up. "The celebration is in 5 weeks," I said. "When were you planning to let me know?" His mouth opened and then closed. "It's a small event," he said. "Serena's family is hosting it, and the guest list was, it's complicated, Mom. There are professional relationships involved. The Langfords have connections we need to maintain, and—" "Was there a seat for me at any table?" I said. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. I folded my hands in my lap. "You borrowed against my name twice. You've been building something for years, using my credit history as your floor. And when it came time to celebrate what you've built, you didn't find room for me. That's not. I'm not asking you to argue with me about it. I'm just asking you to hear it." He leaned back. For a moment, his composure slipped and I could see it. The boy in the suit that didn't quite fit, standing at the cemetery, looking up at me like I was supposed to know what to do next. It was brief. The composure came back. "What would it take," he said carefully, "to revisit the changes you made with Franklin?" "Nothing," I said, "because I'm not revisiting them. Mom, this is my house, Connor. I worked 2 jobs for 8 years to keep it. My name is on this deed the way your name is on my cosign documents. Except I knew what I was signing." He went very still. "The lease renewal," I said. "The 5-year extension. You didn't tell me." The stillness deepened. "Franklin found it in the contract language," I said. "You extended your exposure on a document with my name on it, and you didn't call me. You didn't mention it the last 3 times we spoke. You just let it sit there." Something shifted in his face then. Not guilt, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The calculation behind it. "That was an oversight," he said, too quickly. "It was a choice," I said. "Everything you've done in the last 4 years was a choice. I understand why you made them, but I've made some choices too." He sat with that for a long time. Outside, a car passed on the street. The cat came through the kitchen and paused to look at Connor, then moved on, which felt apt. When he spoke again, his voice was different, smaller. "She's not. Serena's family isn't what I thought it would be. The pressure is constant. Every decision is about how it reflects on the Langford name, and I've been so deep in it for so long that He stopped. "I lost track of some things." "I know," I said. "I should have told you about the lease." "You should have," I said. "And the reunion. I should have called you." I didn't answer that one. I let it stand. He looked at the FedEx envelope. "Are you going to open that?" "No," I said. "Not today." He stood after a while, the way people stand when they know the conversation is done but don't quite know how to leave it. He straightened his jacket. He looked at me, and for a moment neither of us spoke. And I thought about all the things a mother holds, all the versions of a person she carries that the person themselves has long since outgrown or abandoned. "I don't want to lose you," he said. "I know," I said. "But you can't keep me as a resource and lose me as a person at the same time. That's not how it works." He nodded once, very slightly, and walked to the door. I heard the rental car start and back down the driveway and disappear up the street. I sat at the table for a long time after that. Franklin called the following Friday. His voice had the careful, deliberate quality of someone who is about to tell you something significant and wants to make sure the ground is steady first. I sat down at the kitchen table. I need to tell you something I found when I was reviewing the lease guarantee paperwork, he said. I want you hearing this from me and not from someone else. Go ahead, I said. 6 weeks ago, Connor used the office property lease with your name on the guarantee as part of a collateral package for a short-term financing arrangement. Private Lending, a group out of Atlanta. The terms are aggressive, and the structure is, to put it plainly, the kind of thing you do when your conventional credit options are under strain. The kitchen was very quiet. Was my approval required? I said. For a lien or encumbrance? Yes. What he did is technically structured as a pledge rather than a lien, which puts it in a legal gray area. But your name is on the underlying guarantee. If the financing arrangement defaults, and the terms make that a real possibility. The exposure traces back to that lease and back to your signature. I closed my eyes for a moment. Outside, I could hear the wind in the oak trees. That low, continuous sound, like something breathing slowly. How close are we to a problem? I said. The reassignment of your estate disrupted the picture he'd been presenting to this lender. The lender is now requesting documentation that he may not be able to produce cleanly, which is partly why you've been getting calls from his attorneys. He was counting on me staying quiet, I said. He was counting on the same thing he'd been counting on for 4 years, Franklin said. Yes. I stayed on the phone with Franklin for another 20 minutes, working through the steps needed to formally extract my name from every document he'd identified. Some of it would require a fight. Franklin said he was ready for that. I told him I was too. After we hung up, I sat with the lights off for a while. Not from sadness, exactly, but from the weight of a clarity that has no particular comfort attached to it. I had not been loved poorly by accident. I had been useful deliberately, and I had let it happen, not because I was weak, but because I had believed, for 30 years, that usefulness was the same as being valued. It isn't. I know that now, with the kind of certainty that doesn't require being angry to stay true. I turned the kitchen light back on and made myself a cup of tea and called Helen. How are you? She said. I think I'm all right, I said. I think I'm actually all right. She came over the next morning and we walked the trail again. The September light was doing its sideways thing through the trees, and the air had turned properly cool overnight, the first real breath of fall. We walked for a long time without talking much, which is one of the things about a friendship that has lasted long enough to outlive explanation. On the following Monday, I met Marcus at the App State Enrollment Office. He'd taken a half day from the warehouse. He came in wearing the same worn green jacket he wears on cold mornings when he's loading freight, and he looked at the financial aid forms on the table in front of him with an expression I recognized as the one people wear when they are trying very hard not to let hope feel like risk. We went through each page together. He asked careful, precise questions, the kind that tell you someone has been thinking about a thing for a long time and is finally allowing themselves to think about it fully. When it was done, when the forms were submitted and the representative across the table had given him a confirmation number, he sat back in the chair and exhaled very slowly. Spring semester, he said. Spring semester, I said. He looked at me across the table with Carolyn's eyes, the same particular steadiness she always had, and said, Thank you, Miss Dot. I told him what I had told him on the phone, that I know what showing up looks like when you haven't been asked to, and I know what it costs, and that it deserves to be recognized, that it deserves to be met. He nodded and looked down at his confirmation number, and I looked at mine, and we sat there in the quiet, ordinary light of a Monday afternoon in Asheville, two people who had each lost something significant and were, in their own ways, finding their footing again. The Hensley and Park envelope is still in my kitchen drawer, unopened. I have made my peace with what it contains. The way you make peace with weather, not by pretending it isn't there, but by understanding it has no power over what you've already done. Connor called last week, not from a managed, professional composure, but in the way of someone who has been left with themselves long enough to arrive at something honest. He didn't apologize fully, not yet. But he said he'd been thinking. He said he'd been talking to someone, a counselor, which surprised me. He said he'd done things he wasn't proud of, and that he understood if I needed time. I told him I did need time. I told him I hoped he kept going to that counselor. I told him that love doesn't come with a cosign line, that it isn't a financial instrument, that you can't leverage it and expect it to still be there when you look. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I know, Mom. Maybe he does. Maybe that's something." I've learned not to build too far on the architecture of maybe, but I've also learned that refusing to acknowledge it entirely is its own kind of loss. I tend the garden now for the sake of the garden. I walk the trail with Helen because the light is good and the company is better. I show up Monday and Wednesday at the community center for the same reason I always did, because something needs doing, and I know how to do it, and that has always been enough of a reason. I still have the house. I still have the oak trees and the hydrangeas and the cat who has no opinion whatsoever about any of this. I have Marcus, who sent me a photo last week from his first campus visit, standing in front of the engineering building with his hands in his pockets and a look on his face that Carolyn would have known exactly what to do with. I printed it out and put it on the refrigerator, which is where I put things that matter. We don't always get to choose the families we're born into, but we do get to choose who we show up for, who we stand behind, who we trust with the weight of our history and the quiet hope of what comes next. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do with love is to stop pouring it into a place that was never going to hold it and find the place that will. If you've ever given everything you had and felt it disappear into silence, I want you to know that silence is not your verdict. You are allowed to retrieve what's left of yourself. You are allowed to begin again. I'll be out in the garden if you need me.